Late August 1892, the Poydras Street dock in New Orleans. The air tasted of coal smoke, river mud, and something else, a cloying sweet rot that clung to the back of the throat. Below the gangplank of the steamship MS Carver, foremen screamed themselves hoarse, their voices cutting through the oppressive humidity as gangs of stevedores worked in a frantic, desperate rhythm. They swarmed into the ship's hold, emerging with immense stalks of green bananas, each one a £100 bet against time. But for every 10 sound, green stalks that made it onto the dockside conveyors, one emerged yellow, spotted, and already collapsing into a fragrant, mushy ruin. That sickly sweet smell was the scent of a catastrophic financial loss, a visceral introduction to the high-stakes gamble that defined the early banana trade. The story of how the banana rose from a perishable high-risk curiosity to a global commodity begins not on the breakfast tables of the 20th century, but here, in the suffocating heat of a ship's hold. It is a story of a battle fought not with steel, but against biology itself, a race to invent the systems, logistics, and technology required to tame an unpredictable natural process and impose industrial certainty upon it. What the pioneers of this trade were discovering, stalk by ruined stalk, was an uncomfortable truth. You could not just ship a banana. You had to create an entirely new kind of industrial infrastructure to win the war against ripening. For the pioneers of the banana trade, the fundamental dilemma was not rot but respiration. Unlike an orange, which ripens on the tree and then slowly begins to degrade, or an apple, which ripens with predictable slowness, the banana harbored a biological switch. It possessed a unique programmed process of self-destruction known as climacteric ripening. A green banana was essentially a plant in stasis, its cells packed with dense, tasteless starches, comprising up to 25% of its weight. But once triggered, either by a specific maturity point or external stimulus, it began a rapid, irreversible cascade that transformed it from durable cargo into perishable fruit. This process was a biological time bomb, and the challenge facing the entire industry was that nobody yet understood its fuse. The trigger is a single, simple hydrocarbon, ethylene gas. The banana itself produces trace amounts of ethylene, but as it reaches maturity, this production spikes dramatically. Even a tiny concentration, as little as 0.1 to 1.0 parts per million, is enough to initiate the ripening cascade. This initial release of ethylene signals the fruit's own cells to produce even more ethylene, creating an autocatalytic chain reaction that spreads from fruit to fruit. The gas acts as a hormone, activating a series of powerful enzymes. Amylase begins the furious work of converting the long-chain starches into simple sugars like sucrose, glucose, and fructose, raising the sugar content from less than 2% in a green banana to over 20% in a yellow one. Simultaneously, the enzyme pectinase begins to dissolve the pectin that holds the fruit's cell walls together, causing the once firm flesh to soften into the familiar creamy texture. The green chlorophyll in the peel is broken down, revealing the yellow carotenoid pigments beneath. The logistical implications of this process were catastrophic. A single prematurely ripening banana in a ship's hold could release enough ethylene gas to trigger its immediate neighbours. Those neighbours would then begin their own accelerated ethylene production, creating a wave of ripening that could propagate through a multi-ton shipment in a matter of hours. The heat generated by this intense respiratory activity, a single ton of ripening bananas can produce over 1,000 British thermal units of heat per hour, would then accelerate the process further. A shipping container that left Central America as a hold full of durable green vegetables could arrive in New Orleans as a 20-ton self-heating compost pile. The financial loss was total. This was not a question of simple spoilage that could be managed. It was an inexorable biological sprint, and winning the war against ripening meant finding a way to prevent the race from ever beginning. Before the problem of ripening could be solved at an industrial scale, it first needed to be proven beatable at any scale. The inciting incident, the single data point that suggested victory was even possible, came in 1870. The protagonist was not a biologist or an engineer, but a 46-year-old Cape Cod sea captain named Lorenzo Dow Baker. Baker was the seasoned master of the two-masted schooner, the Telegraph, and his primary business was plying the waters between the Americas, trading in durable goods like bamboo. But on a stop in Port Antonio, Jamaica, he took note of the local bananas. a fruit so perishable it was considered worthless for long-distance trade. On a speculative impulse, Baker made a small but consequential wager. He purchased 160 bunches of hard, green, inedible bananas from a local planter, paying a mere shilling per bunch. This was a bet against the biological clock described in shipping manifests and financial ledgers as total loss. Baker was wagering that his ship's speed, combined with a healthy measure of luck, could outrun the banana's internal self-destructing cascade. The 160 bunches were loaded not as primary cargo, but as a speculative side bet stowed in the hold. The Telegraph then set sail for Jersey City, New Jersey, beginning a race that would change the American diet forever. For 11 days the Telegraph sailed north. Baker had no refrigeration, no ventilation systems, and no scientific understanding of ethylene gas. His only tool was the speed of his schooner, a vessel designed for fast passages. When he arrived in Jersey City and the holds were opened, the result was stunning. The fruit had not rotted. Instead, through a perfect combination of timing, temperature, and fortuitous conditions, the bananas had ripened in transit into a beautiful uniform yellow. They were immediately saleable. He sold the entire cargo to a local broker for $2 a bunch, transforming a trivial investment into a staggering return of over 1,000%. But the true significance of Baker's 1870 voyage was not the profit. It was the proof of concept. This single, lucky journey demonstrated two fundamental truths that would underpin a future global industry. First, it revealed the existence of a vast untapped consumer market in North America that was ready and willing to purchase the exotic fruit. Second, and more importantly, it proved that the war against ripening was not unwinnable. The biological time bomb could be defused. Baker's success transformed the problem of spoilage from a logistical impossibility into an engineering challenge. How to take his accidental, singular victory and replicate it with industrial certainty 10,000 times over. The race was no longer against biology alone. It was now a race to build the system that could defeat it. Baker's accidental triumph had proven that the banana trade was not a logistical impossibility, but the lesson the nascent industry took from his 1870 voyage was a dangerously simplistic one. Where Baker had succeeded through a fortuitous combination of speed and circumstance, his would-be successors saw only a single variable: velocity. They concluded that the war against ripening was a simple sprint, a race that could be won by applying more power and more speed. This interpretation launched a period of frantic, costly, and ultimately futile experimentation, a series of tactical failures predicated on a fundamental misreading of the biological enemy. The first industrial-scale efforts were not a battle of wits or technology, but a brute-force assault on biology itself. The strategy was crude but direct. Shippers contracted the fastest vessels available, the last generation of clipper-bowed fruit schooners, prized for their ability to sail close to the wind, and the new, costly but powerful screw-propeller steamships that promised predictable timetables independent of weather. To give these ships a head start, the fruit was harvested at a stage of extreme immaturity, cut so green and hard it was more akin to a root vegetable than a fruit. Planters were instructed to harvest at what was called 3/4 full, a stage where the bananas were still angular and undeveloped, containing the maximum possible starch content. The stalks were then packed into unventilated holds with maximum density, the logic being that more bananas per voyage would offset the inevitable losses. This was the doctrine of overwhelming force, an attempt to saturate the supply chain so that some product, any product, might survive the journey. The results were catastrophic. This war of attrition was a battle the shippers were consistently losing, with spoilage rates regularly exceeding 50% of the cargo. On many voyages, the loss was total. The strategy of packing holds tightly and sailing at speed proved to be a fatal paradox. Instead of outrunning the ripening cascade, it actively created the perfect conditions for it. A single, slightly more mature bunch of bananas would begin its ethylene production, and in the stagnant, crowded air of the hold, the gas was trapped, triggering a chain reaction. The immense respiratory heat generated by tens of tons of ripening fruit, over 1,000 BTUs per ton per hour, became concentrated, turning the ship's hold into a self-powering convection oven that accelerated the very enzymatic breakdown they were racing against. They were not outrunning biology, they were fueling it. The arithmetic of spoilage was brutal and inescapable, demonstrating with terrible clarity that speed alone was not a weapon. It was merely a way to arrive at the destination of financial ruin more quickly. The strategic impasse described in the ledgers of ruined shipping companies demanded a new class of thinking. The war against ripening could not be won with the tactical tools of sea captains and fruit brokers alone. The repeated catastrophic failures of the brute force approach demonstrated with mathematical certainty that victory required a fundamental shift in doctrine. The solution, when it came, emerged not from the design of a faster ship, but from the minds of two men who understood that the problem of the banana was not a problem of shipping at all. It was a problem of industrial organization. The first of these men was Andrew Preston, a shrewd and successful Boston produce seller. Preston viewed the problem from the market end of the supply chain. He understood the vast growing appetite of the American consumer, but he also experienced, shipment by shipment, the financial havoc wrought by inconsistent supply and unpredictable quality. For him, a shipload of spoiled bananas was not just a loss. It was a broken promise to his network of grocers, a blow to market stability, and a demonstration of the trade's fundamental unreliability. Preston understood that a stable price and a household brand could only be built on a foundation of absolute consistency, a consistency the existing system was structurally incapable of providing. The second man saw the problem from its origin. Minor C. Keith was a railroad magnate, a man who had spent decades wrestling the Costa Rican jungle into submission to lay thousands of miles of track. To generate freight for his railways, Keith had begun planting bananas alongside his tracks in the 1870s. He was not a fruit trader, but an industrialist, accustomed to thinking in terms of infrastructure, labor control, and capital investment on a massive scale. Where others saw a delicate fruit, Keith saw tonnage. He understood that controlling the path to the port was meaningless if you could not also control the quality, quantity, and timing of the product that travelled on it. His experience was in building closed systems in hostile environments. In 1885, the fusion of these two perspectives was formalized with the creation of the Boston Fruit Company, the direct precursor to a corporate empire. Preston, the market expert, and Keith, the infrastructure magnate, arrived at a single revolutionary conclusion. The only way to win the war against ripening was to refuse to fight it on biology's terms. They would instead build a system so complete and so controlled that it could dictate those terms. Their vision was strategically audacious. They would not simply buy and ship bananas. They would create a vertically integrated banana business, controlling the entire logistical chain, from the moment a banana plant was put in the ground to the moment it was sold in a North American city. This was a new doctrine of total industrial control, a declaration of war not just on spoilage, but on chance itself. This new doctrine of total industrial control, conceived by Preston and Keith, required a fundamental re-engineering of the container itself. The enemy was no longer spoilage as an abstract concept. It was now understood as a specific set of chemical and thermal conditions. The architects of the Boston Fruit Company identified two primary targets that had to be defeated inside the ship's hold: respiratory heat and ethylene gas. The first was a byproduct of the ripening process, and the second was its catalyst. This understanding transformed ship design from a problem of naval architecture into one of environmental engineering. The hold was no longer a box for carrying things. It had to become a weapon, designed with surgical precision to neutralize the biological enemy within. The first tactical shift was from containment to dispersal. The sealed, unventilated holds of the brute force era had proven to be self-saturating gas chambers, trapping the very ethylene that sparked the ripening cascade. The first generation of Boston Fruit Company ships therefore incorporated a new weapon: forced air ventilation. This was not a matter of simply opening hatches to the tropical air. It involved a system of powerful fans and carefully designed ductwork, engineered to draw in fresh ocean air, circulate it throughout the densely packed cargo, and exhaust the stale, ethylene-tainted atmosphere. The goal was a specific number of air changes per hour, calculated to keep the concentration of ethylene gas below the critical threshold of 0.1 parts per million. It was a significant improvement, an active defense against the chain reaction, but it was not a decisive solution. Ventilation could only remove the enemy after it had already appeared. It could not prevent its initial creation. The truly decisive weapon, the one that represented the full expression of Keith's industrial mindset, was refrigeration. If ventilation was a defensive shield, refrigeration was an offensive measure that preemptively disarmed the banana. By mechanically cooling the holds to a precise constant temperature, empirically determined to be between 56 and 58 degrees Fahrenheit, the entire biological process could be forced into a state of suspended animation. At this temperature, the banana's metabolic rate plummets. Its respiration slows dramatically, reducing the output of respiratory heat by over 80%. More critically, the enzymatic processes responsible for producing ethylene gas are almost completely suppressed. The biological time bomb was not just contained, it was put into a deep, controlled sleep. This fusion of technologies created a new kind of vessel. The cargo hold was transformed from a simple cavity in a hull into a complex integrated life support system. Refrigeration machinery, a massive capital investment, worked to suppress the banana's internal clock, while the ventilation system stood as a constant guard, ready to purge any trace amounts of rogue ethylene gas before it could trigger a cascade. The ship itself became a mobile cold storage fortress, an extension of the factory floor projected across the ocean. For competitors still gambling on speed and luck, this expenditure was seen as extravagant folly. But for the Boston Fruit Company, it was the only logical expression of their new doctrine. It was the engineering required to impose industrial certainty upon unpredictable biology, turning a 20-ton compost pile in waiting into a secure refrigerated vault. The creation of the mobile cold storage fortress at sea solved the first, most critical phase of the war against ripening. But in doing so, it merely relocated the battlefront from the Caribbean Sea to the American continent. A cargo hold kept at a perfect 57 degrees Fahrenheit could deliver 20,000 stalks of green, hibernating bananas to a port like New Orleans or Boston. But the moment those stalks were unloaded onto a dock and moved into a standard, uninsulated railroad boxcar for domestic distribution, the biological clock would restart with a vengeance. Temperatures inside a boxcar crossing the American South in summer could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit, conditions that would trigger a catastrophic, rapid ripening cascade within hours. The problem of sea transit had been solved, but now the industry faced the last mile problem, which in reality was a last 1,000 miles problem. The solution, like so many industrial breakthroughs, was not invented but appropriated. It came from another industry waging its own high-stakes war against biology, the meatpackers of Chicago. The challenge facing men like Gustavus Swift in the 1870s was how to ship processed beef from the massive Chicago stockyards to the lucrative markets of the East Coast, displacing the inefficient system of shipping live cattle. His answer was the refrigerated railroad car, a technology he perfected and patented in 1877. Railroad companies, heavily invested in transporting live cattle, initially refused to build these cars, forcing Swift to create his own private fleet. His design was a masterpiece of applied thermodynamics, a rolling icebox engineered for a single purpose, to arrest decay. The mechanics were brutally simple yet highly effective. At each end of a heavily insulated wooden car sat a large compartment, or bunker, capable of holding a combined total of over 4,500 kilograms of block ice. To achieve temperatures below freezing for shipping meat, this ice was often mixed with salt, which lowered its melting point. For the more delicate requirements of fruit, pure ice was sufficient. As the ice melted, cold, dense air would sink from the bunkers and flow downwards. A slatted wooden subfloor allowed this river of cold air to circulate underneath the cargo, absorbing heat as it travelled the length of the car. Having warmed slightly, the now lighter air would rise at the opposite end and be drawn back towards the top of the ice bunkers, where it was rechilled, completing a continuous passive convection cycle. It was a self-powering system that could maintain a specific cool temperature for a journey lasting more than a week. For the architects of the banana trade, the refrigerated car, or reefer as it came to be known, was the missing link. It was the terrestrial extension of the refrigerated ship's hold. Stalks of green bananas could be moved directly from the precisely controlled environment of the vessel into the equally controlled environment of the reefer car. The cold chain, that unbroken series of refrigerated handoffs, remained intact. This system allowed the Boston Fruit Company and its competitors to push their product deep into the American interior, opening up markets that were previously unreachable. The banana was no longer a coastal curiosity. It was now poised to become a national staple. But this victory created an entirely new and paradoxical challenge. The system of total control was now so effective at preventing ripening that it could deliver a boxcar of perfectly preserved, yet still hard, green, and inedible bananas to a grocer in Omaha. The final piece of the puzzle was still missing, a method for waking the banana up on command. The perfection of the cold chain created a new and profound strategic paradox. The system was now so effective at preventing ripening that it had, in effect, broken the banana. A grocer in Omaha or Chicago could now receive a boxcar full of pristine, but rock-hard and inedible green fruit. This success revealed the system's final critical vulnerability. It was a one-way street. The architects of the banana trade had built the world's most effective biological prison, a system designed with military precision to suppress and contain a natural process. But they had not yet built a key to unlock the door. The final battle in the war against ripening would not be about preservation. It would be about resurrection. This was the moment of the narrative's central, transformative realization. For decades, the industry leaders had believed they were fighting a war against time, a simple sprint from plantation to market. But the refrigerated ship and the reefer car demonstrated this premise was flawed. The true enemy had never been time, it was chemistry. The breakthrough was the understanding that the ripening cascade was not a chaotic, uncontrollable event, but a predictable and governable biological process. It was a chemical reaction that could be suppressed, but more importantly, it was a reaction that could be initiated. The strategic shift was seismic. The goal changed from simply delaying a biological process to seizing absolute control of it. All previous efforts, from faster ships to forced air ventilation to refrigeration, had been defensive measures, designed to hold back the inevitable tide of enzymatic breakdown. The new doctrine was offensive. It was based on the understanding that ethylene gas, the catastrophic saboteur in the ship's hold, could be weaponized as a precise trigger in the warehouse. If a concentration as low as 0.1 parts per million could set off a chain reaction in a sealed container, then a controlled introduction of that same gas, under specific thermal conditions, could be used to launch a coordinated, uniform ripening process on command. This reconceptualization turned the entire supply chain on its head. The goal was no longer to deliver a ripe banana, but to deliver a biologically neutral one, a blank slate. The banana would be harvested green, placed into a state of suspended animation at 57 degrees Fahrenheit for its entire journey, and delivered to a regional distribution center still in its inert, starchy state. There, it would enter the final stage of the industrial process, a purpose-built chamber where temperature, humidity, and atmospheric composition could be controlled to the decimal point. The fight was over. All that was left was to give the order to ripen. Before the final act of controlled resurrection in the ripening room could even be conceived, the industry first had to conquer the single greatest engineering challenge in its entire system, the refrigerated steamship itself. The decision to pursue marine refrigeration represented an almost impossibly audacious capital investment, a bet that the brute force of mechanical engineering could tame the subtle complexities of biology. The result was not merely a ship with a cold room. It was an entirely new class of vessel, a purpose-built industrial weapon christened with some marketing flair, the Great White Fleet. The story of these ships is not a tale of naval architecture, but of thermodynamics waged in a hostile environment. The problem was not simply to make a hold cold, but to create and sustain a precise, uniform and constant temperature of 57 degrees Fahrenheit, approximately 14 degrees Celsius, throughout a multi-ton cargo of living, breathing fruit. A drop to 53 degrees would cause chilling injury, where the banana's skin turns a smoky, unappealing grey, and its flesh fails to convert starch to sugar. A rise to 60 degrees would be enough to restart the ripening cascade, defeating the entire purpose of the voyage. This 4-degree window was the battleground. The heart of the reefer was its ammonia compression refrigeration system, a technology that was both powerful and profoundly dangerous. A massive steam-driven compressor, often taking up a significant portion of the aft engine room, would draw in ammonia gas and subject it to immense pressure, over 150 pounds per square inch. This compression raised the gas's temperature significantly. This hot, high-pressure gas was then piped through condenser coils, where circulating seawater would draw away the heat, forcing the ammonia to liquefy. It was this high-pressure liquid ammonia that held the system's potential. Piped forward into the insulated holds, it was released through an expansion valve into a vast network of brine-filled coils. As the ammonia expanded back into a low-pressure gas, it underwent a dramatic drop in temperature, becoming intensely cold and absorbing enormous quantities of heat from the surrounding environment. The brine, now chilled to just above freezing, was then circulated through thousands of feet of piping lining the cargo holds. Physics took over. But implementing this system inside a vibrating, corroding steel box sailing through 85-degree tropical water was an unprecedented challenge. Steel is an excellent thermal conductor, meaning the hull itself was constantly trying to heat the cargo. To fight this, the holds were encased in up to 18 inches of insulation, a layered defense of cork, silicate cotton, and tar-impregnated paper. The machinery itself was a constant maintenance nightmare. The combination of salt-laden sea air, high humidity, and constant vibration from the ship's engines worked relentlessly to corrode pipes, loosen fittings, and compromise valve seals. A single pinhole leak in a high-pressure ammonia line was a catastrophic failure, capable of releasing a toxic, suffocating gas that was lethal to both the crew and the cargo. The men who ran these systems, a new class of marine engineer, did not just manage machines. They managed a constant, high-stakes battle against heat, corrosion, vibration, and catastrophic failure. Their victory was not just delivering bananas, it was delivering the industrial certainty that a global business could be built upon. The engineering triumph detailed in a single refrigerated steamship was a monumental achievement of industrial science. But the Boston Fruit Company's strategy was never about a single ship. The true, world-altering ambition was revealed on March 30th, 1899, with the formal consolidation of Preston and Keith's interest into a new corporate behemoth, the United Fruit Company. This new entity, capitalized at an immense $20 million, immediately leveraged its financial power not to build a better ship, but to commission an entire navy. This was the industrial-scale deployment of the cold chain, a strategic decision designed to make competition functionally impossible. The company placed an initial order for 3 refrigerated steamships, a contract worth over $1.5 million, the equivalent of more than $50 million today. These vessels were the genesis of what would be marketed to the public as the Great White Fleet, their hulls painted a brilliant gleaming white not just for branding, but for the practical thermodynamic purpose of reflecting the relentless tropical sun. But the fleet's true purpose was strategic, not aesthetic. By 1904, the fleet numbered 11 purpose-built reefers, and by 1909, it had expanded to 25. This was an unprecedented logistical system, a fleet capable of moving over 15 million stalks of bananas per year in a continuous climate-controlled conveyor belt from the tropics to North America. The scale was overwhelming. It represented an industrial avalanche of cold, stable supply. For rival shippers still dependent on fast schooners and the brute force strategy of the 1880s, this was not competition. It was an extinction-level event. Their business models, built on speed and luck, became obsolete overnight. They were fighting a war of biology, while United Fruit was waging and winning a war of capital. No smaller company could hope to secure the financing necessary to build even one refrigerated vessel, let alone a fleet to match United Fruit's. The arithmetic of the industry was now decisively one-sided. The Great White Fleet created a barrier to entry so high and so absolute that it secured a near-total monopoly on the banana trade. The company no longer had to simply outship its competitors. It had rendered their very existence a financial impossibility. With the formation of United Fruit and the launch of its Great White Fleet, the fragmented, speculative attempts to outrun biology finally gave way to a unified industrial system designed to master it. To understand its revolutionary efficiency, one must follow the journey not of a shipload, but of a single 100-pound bunch of bananas harvested near Tela, Honduras in early 1905. The journey begins not with a frantic race, but with a calculated industrial decision. A foreman inspects the stalk, confirms it is at the precise 3/4 full stage of development, still angular, starch-dense, and biologically inert, and it is severed from the plant. This is not yet a fruit. It is raw material designated for processing. From the plantation, the stalk's journey is not left to chance. It is loaded within the hour onto a company-owned narrow-gauge railway car, a direct expression of Minor Keith's original infrastructure strategy. The train does not wait for a full load. It runs on a strict, unyielding schedule, moving the green harvest from the humid interior to the port at Teller with industrial urgency. There, the Great White Fleet steamship Calamares is not arriving. It is waiting, its ammonia compression systems having run for the past 12 hours. The holds are already a stable, pre-chilled 57 degrees Fahrenheit. The stalk is transferred from the rail car, across the dock, and into hold number 2 in a continuous, unbroken movement. It is a logistical handoff executed with the precision of a factory assembly line, a stark contrast to the chaotic, rotting piles of fruit that defined the New Orleans docks just a decade prior. For the next 6 days, the stalk exists in a state of engineered hibernation. It is one of 90,000 such stalks packed into the insulated darkness, but its environment is controlled with microscopic precision. Deep in the aft engine room, marine engineers wage a constant war against the 88-degree Caribbean sea temperatures just inches away on the other side of the hull. They monitor gauges, listen for the telltale signs of a pressure drop in the ammonia lines, and ensure the powerful fans circulate the chilled air, pulling away the minute traces of respiratory heat and ethylene that represent the enemy. The stalk's internal clock is arrested. Its starch, comprising over 20% of its weight, remains locked. The enzymes that trigger the ripening cascade are held in a state of total suppression. It is a passenger in a mobile cryogenic vault, crossing 1/500 nautical miles without aging a single biological hour. The system's final, seamless transfer demonstrates its true scope. Upon arrival in New Orleans, the hatches of hold number 2 are opened to reveal not a fragrant yellowing cargo, but a vast expanse of hard, green, and perfectly preserved stalks. The temperature in the hold reads 57.5 degrees. On the adjacent railway siding, a line of insulated reefer cars stands ready, their own ice bunkers pre-chilled for 24 hours. The stalk is moved by conveyor directly from the ship's hold into the waiting rail car. The door is sealed, and the cold chain remains unbroken. The system has performed its function with terrifying perfection. It has successfully transported an object from a Honduran jungle to a rail yard in the American South, defeating heat, time, and biology. The stalk of bananas arrives in Omaha, Nebraska, 7 days later, in the same condition it was harvested, perfect, green, and completely inedible. The war of preservation had been won. Now the final challenge remained: how to bring the fruit back to life on command. The arrival of these flawlessly preserved green bananas in the American interior represented more than just a logistical victory. It was the foundational act for a radical psychological transformation in the mind of the American consumer. Before the establishment of the cold chain, the banana was a symbol of exotic, unreliable luxury. For a shopper in Chicago or St. Louis in the 1880s, finding one was a rare event. It was an expensive novelty, costing as much as 10 cents, the price of 2 loaves of bread, and its quality was a gamble. It was the food of the wealthy, an adornment for fine hotel fruit bowls, a fleeting taste of the tropics. Its defining characteristics were scarcity and unpredictability. The system built by United Fruit shattered these assumptions with the brute force of overwhelming consistent supply. The refrigerated steamship and the reefer car worked in concert to perform a kind of industrial alchemy, transmuting a perishable high-risk liability into a low-cost, utterly predictable consumer good. By 1910, the banana was no longer a novelty item in port cities. It was a ubiquitous presence in grocery stores in Ohio, Nebraska, and Colorado, selling for a nickel a dozen. The price had not just fallen, it had collapsed into democratic affordability. This was a fundamental cognitive shift. The reliability of the cold chain meant that for the first time, a grocer in Omaha could order bananas with the same confidence he ordered flour or salt. The housewife could add them to her weekly shopping list, certain they would be available and affordable. This predictability was the true revolution. It moved the banana out of the category of a rare treat and into the new, emerging category of the modern staple food. The consumer never saw the ammonia compressors or the insulation-lined holds, but they experienced its effect with stunning clarity. A perfect yellow banana available for pennies, year-round. The exotic had become mundane. The luxury had become a daily commodity. The implications were profound. The banana became one of the very first products of a truly globalized industrial food system. Its journey from a Honduran plantation, through the manufactured chill of the Great White Fleet, across the American rail network, and ultimately to a ripening room. This was not agriculture in the traditional sense. It was a continuous, continent-spanning manufacturing process. The consumer was not merely buying a fruit. They were buying the end product of an assembly line thousands of miles long, a masterpiece of industrial logistics that had conquered time, distance, and biology itself. The commercial transformation of the banana detailed in the pricing and availability of the fruit was not an accidental byproduct of a better shipping method. It was the direct, calculated result of a corporate strategy so total and all-encompassing, it represented a new paradigm in global business. The cold chain, in its final, perfected form, was not just a logistical solution. It was the rigid, technological spine of United Fruit's doctrine of absolute vertical integration. This was a conscious, deliberate architecture of power, designed to control every variable, eliminate every external dependency, and seize every possible cent of profit from the soil of Central America to the fruit bowl of an American family. The strategy manifested as a physical empire of interconnected company-owned assets. United Fruit owned the land itself, hundreds of thousands of acres across Honduras, Guatemala, and Costa Rica, cleared and converted into a vast monoculture of banana production. It owned the thousands of miles of narrow-gauge railways required to move the harvest from plantation to port. It owned the telegraph lines that coordinated these movements with military precision. It owned the port facilities, the wharves, the power generation, the loading conveyors, and in many cases the entire towns where its labor force lived. It owned the Great White Fleet, a private navy of refrigerated vessels that constituted the world's most advanced logistical system. Upon arrival, it controlled the dockside infrastructure, the refrigerated rail cars for inland distribution, and finally, the purpose-built ripening rooms that represented the final stage of the manufacturing process. This system was an impenetrable economic fortress. It was a closed loop from which no profit could escape, and into which no competitor could enter. The barrier to entry was no longer the biological puzzle of ripening. It was now a wall of pure, insurmountable capital. A rival could not hope to compete by buying a handful of ships. They would have to replicate the entire continent-spanning system, an investment of tens of millions of dollars that was financially impossible. The cold chain was not merely a way to transport fruit. It was a weapon of monopolistic warfare, a moat filled with chilled water and thermodynamic certainty, protecting an empire built on the principle of total, indivisible control. The two approaches, separated by less than 2 decades, represented a fundamental and irreconcilable schism in worldview. The methodology of the early traders, from Lorenzo Dow Baker to the failed experimenters who followed him, was that of the gambler. Their world was defined by intuition, risk, and speed. A stalk of bananas was a bet, and a voyage was a hand played against the house of biology, with spoilage rates serving as the house's rake. A successful journey, like Baker's 1870 trip to Jersey City, yielded a staggering speculative return. But this was the logic of a lottery jackpot. The underlying business model was predicated on luck, a variable that could never be controlled, scaled, or relied upon. Their instrument was the fast ship. Their hope was a fair wind and a fortunate lack of rogue ethylene. The doctrine of United Fruit, by contrast, was that of the industrial engineer. Preston and Keith were not playing the game. They were redesigning it so that chance was no longer a factor. For them, a stalk of bananas was not a bet but a unit of inventory. The problem of ripening was not a race but a question of applied thermodynamics and chemical suppression. Their primary instrument was not velocity but capital, deployed with strategic precision to build a system that made luck irrelevant. They did not hope for a favourable outcome. They engineered it, using ammonia compressors, insulated holds, and a continent-spanning cold chain to impose absolute unyielding predictability on an unpredictable natural process. This was the essential strategic divide. The sea captain saw a fruit to be shipped. The industrialist saw a raw material to be processed through a multi-stage manufacturing system that happened to include a 1,500-mile ocean transit. One philosophy was based on the courage to take a risk. The other was based on the capital and scientific will to eliminate risk entirely. In this contest, the romantic ethos of the seaborne gambler could not survive. It was the historical equivalent of a cavalry charge against a machine gun nest. The victory of one doctrine over the other was not a matter of competition. It was a matter of programmatic certainty. The absolute victory of the cold chain, a system engineered to impose total certainty upon biology, revealed a final, ironic flaw in its own design. The system had become a victim of its own stunning efficiency. For the wholesaler in Chicago or Denver, this triumph manifested as a £40,000 problem arriving by the trainload. They would now take possession of a reefer car containing a cargo of perfectly preserved, yet commercially worthless green inventory. These were not yet bananas in a retail sense. They were biologically inert objects, their flesh still dense with the 20% starch content of an unripened plant, devoid of the sugar and texture that defined the fruit. This created an entirely new bottleneck at the final link of the supply chain. A grocer did not simply want yellow bananas. They required a carefully calibrated portfolio of ripeness. They needed fruit at what would be codified as color stage 4, yellow with green tips, for immediate sale to a customer who would consume it in a day or two. They needed fruit at color stage 3, more green than yellow, to hold in the back room for restocking the display tomorrow. A shipment of uniformly green, rock-hard bananas was as unsaleable to a grocer as a shipment of rotting ones. They could not sell a promise. They had to sell an edible product. Left to their own devices in a warehouse, the green bananas would awaken from their cold-induced hibernation on their own chaotic, unpredictable schedule. Some bunches might begin to ripen in 2 days. Others could remain stubbornly green for over a week. The wholesaler was now confronted with a warehouse full of dormant potential, facing the unforgiving arithmetic of retail demand without the tools to meet it. This reintroduced the very element of gambling and chance that the entire refrigerated apparatus was built to eliminate. It proved with terrible clarity that the final phase of the banana's journey could not be left to nature. A new kind of engineered environment was required, a factory that did not make a product, but brought one to life on a strict industrial timetable. The solution to the wholesaler's £40,000 problem was not biological, but architectural. It was the invention of a new kind of factory, a final processing stage designed not to make a product, but to awaken one on command. This innovation, the pressurized ripening room, represented the ultimate ironic completion of the industrial system. Here, in the final link of the cold chain, the banana industry's greatest enemy would be systematically transformed into its most essential tool. The very ethylene gas that could trigger a catastrophic 20-ton Compass pile at sea was about to be weaponized as the instrument of its final perfection. The design was a masterpiece of controlled environmental engineering. A ripening room was, in essence, a hermetically sealed, airtight chamber where every atmospheric variable could be manipulated with industrial precision. Into these rooms, the pallets of green, hibernating bananas were moved. First, the temperature was carefully raised from the transport holding point of 57 degrees Fahrenheit to a narrow optimal ripening range between 62 and 68 degrees. The humidity was increased to over 90% to prevent moisture loss. Then came the decisive act. A measured shockingly high concentration of ethylene gas, often 1,000 parts per million, 1,000 times the concentration that spelled disaster in a ship's hold, was injected into the sealed atmosphere for a period of 24 hours. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. This massive, deliberate dose of ethylene acted as an undeniable industrial command, a shock that forced every single banana in the room to initiate its ripening cascade simultaneously. The fruit's own autocatalytic ethylene production, the chain reaction so feared in the supply chain, was now triggered on a programmatic schedule. Once started, the process was irreversible. After the initial gassing, the rooms were vented and the fruit was held at the desired temperature, allowing wholesalers to precisely manage the speed of the conversion from starch to sugar. They could now produce, on a single, predictable timetable, an entire shipment of bananas calibrated to color stage 3 for backroom inventory and stage 4 for immediate retail display. The gamble was over. The last vestige of chance had been engineered out of the system. The war against biology had ended not in a stalemate, but in a final decisive act of total command. The invention of the pressurized ripening room, as detailed in company memorandums and engineering blueprints, was not the end of the industrial process. It was the beginning of the final, most precise phase. The room itself was the weapon. The new science of forced ripening had to write the operational doctrine. The goal was no longer the mere prevention of catastrophic loss, but the achievement of unprecedented programmatic uniformity. For the first time, the industry was engaged in a scientific campaign to solve a complex multivariable equation where the inputs were temperature, humidity, ethylene concentration, and time, and the desired output was a perfectly predictable, commercially optimized fruit. The work was methodical and empirical, a series of experiments that codified the banana's biological responses into a set of industrial commandments. Temperature, it was discovered, acted as the primary accelerator. Holding the fruit below 61 degrees Fahrenheit after gassing resulted in a sluggish, uneven ripening cascade, a condition known as chilling. Pushing the temperature above 68 degrees accelerated the conversion of starch to sugar too violently, producing a soft, easily bruised fruit with a drastically reduced shelf life. The ideal range was therefore set in stone, between 62 and 66 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity was found to be equally critical. An atmosphere with less than 90% relative humidity caused the banana to lose water through its peel, reducing its final saleable weight and giving the skin a withered, unappealing appearance. The protocol thus demanded a constant humidity of 90 to 95%. The ethylene shot itself was calibrated not for subtlety, but for overwhelming force, a 24-hour flood of 3,000 parts per million, a concentration orders of magnitude higher than nature's own trigger, to ensure that every single banana in the room began its march from starch to sugar in absolute lockstep. The culmination of this scientific endeavor was not a research paper, but an operational tool of immense power, the standardized 7-stage banana color chart. This simple visual guide, codifying the fruit's progression from the inert, starch-filled green of stage 1 to the fully ripened, sugar-spotted yellow of stage 7, was the ultimate expression of industrial control. It translated the complexities of enzymatic action and starch hydrolysis into a simple, actionable manufacturing plan. A wholesaler could now receive an order for 50 cases at stage 3.5 and consult a table to determine the precise combination of temperature and time required to produce that exact result with industrial certainty. This was the final decisive act in the war against biology. The last vestige of natural unpredictability had been analyzed, quantified, and systematically eliminated. Chance had been replaced by a chart. The standardized banana color chart, often printed on a simple swatch of cardboard and tacked to the wall of a ripening room, appeared deceptively simple. But this was not a mere visual aid. It was a contract. It was a new industrial language, translating the complex variable processes of enzymatic action and starch hydrolysis into an unambiguous, universal set of numerical commands. For the first time, a foreman in a Honduran packing house, a wholesaler in Chicago, and a grocer in Topeka could speak about the state of a banana with absolute programmatic clarity. The system no longer had any room for subjective terms like a little green or mostly yellow. Now there was only the objective, quantified reality of a number. For the grocer, the implications of this new language were profound. He was no longer a passive recipient of whatever arrived on the morning truck. He was now a procurement officer, dictating exact specifications based on a predictable timeline of consumer demand. An order placed on a Monday could now read 20 cases at stage 3, 40 cases at stage 4 for delivery Wednesday. The wholesaler understood this was not just a request for a color, but a command for a future state. He knew that the stage 3 bananas, still showing significant green, held in the grocer's backroom at 60 degrees Fahrenheit, would transition to a perfect full yellow stage 5 by the weekend rush. The stage 4 fruit was for immediate display, its shelf life and appearance calibrated for a customer making a purchase that afternoon. It was the birth of just-in-time inventory management for a perishable good. This was the final conceptual leap. With the color chart as its definitive specification sheet, the fruit ceased to be a product of agriculture. It had been fully reconceived as a component of industry. It could be ordered by part number, stage 3.5, with a known and guaranteed performance curve, just like a ball bearing or a standardized screw. The chart was the ultimate expression of the system envisioned by Preston and Keith, a world where a biological organism was entirely subsumed into the logic of the factory floor. The unpredictable chaos of nature had been decisively replaced by the absolute, predictable order of a parts catalogue. The full integrated architecture was now complete. It was a single continent-spanning machine whose components were now visible in their totality. The company-owned land, engineered for monoculture production, the private railways, moving raw material on a strict timetable, the refrigerated steamships of the Great White Fleet, serving as mobile cryogenic vaults, the network of insulated reefer cars, extending the cold chain 1,000 miles inland, the pressurized ripening rooms acting as a final processing stage, and the standardized color chart, serving as the system's universal operating language. Each element, a victory in its own right, was now revealed to be a single, interlocking gear in one of the most ambitious manufacturing systems ever conceived. This was the moment of terrible, clarifying insight. The United Fruit Company was never truly in the business of selling bananas. The fruit was merely the medium. The real product, the one that built an empire and created a global market out of nothing, was consistency. It was the industrial-grade certainty that a grocer in landlocked Denver could order a case of stage 3.5 bananas on a Tuesday and have them arrive on Thursday, ready to be displayed as a perfect, unblemished stage 4.5 for the weekend rush, at a price that almost never fluctuated. This was an unprecedented commercial achievement. What Preston and Keith's system had built was not a supply chain. It was an assembly line for a natural object. It systematically stripped the banana of every variable that defined it as a product of agriculture. It eliminated seasonality, neutralized biological unpredictability, and erased geographical distance. While apples and oranges remained beholden to harvest cycles and regional availability, the banana became the world's first ever fungible, year-round, standardized global fruit. United Fruit did not just conquer spoilage, they conquered nature itself, recasting a perishable tropical fruit as a predictable, mass-produced industrial good. This industrial architecture, this continent-spanning machine perfected to process a single tropical fruit, represented a strategic breakthrough whose implications extended far beyond the banana trade itself. The solution to the banana problem was never just about bananas. It was the creation of a universal template, a logistical and technological blueprint for conquering the tyranny of spoilage for any perishable good. The system designed to deliver a consistent, affordable banana had, in fact, created the operating system for the entire modern global trade in fresh food. The core components were not fruit-specific. They were universal principles of applied biology and thermodynamics. The unbroken cold chain, that seamless river of 57-degree air flowing from ship to rail car to warehouse, the precise manipulation of atmospheric gas to suppress and then command-initiate a biological process, the vertical integration of transport and processing into a single, unblinking system of control. These were the foundational pillars of the new science of global logistics. Any product whose value was a race against a biological clock could now be plugged into this architecture. The proof is found today in every aisle of a modern supermarket. The avocado, shipped hard and green from Mexico, its own climacteric ripening held in stasis until it is awakened by an ethylene shot in a warehouse in Illinois. The winter raspberries and blueberries arriving from Chile and Peru, their impossibly short lifespan made profitable only through the flawless execution of the same refrigerated supply chain pioneered by the Great White Fleet. The cut flowers flown from Colombia, transported in a state of suspended animation, to bloom on command thousands of miles from where they were grown. Each of these industries, and countless others, is a direct logistical descendant of the system built to solve the banana problem. They're all running on the hardware and software developed in the war against ripening. The unprecedented year-round abundance that consumers now take for granted is not a miracle of agriculture. It is the enduring legacy of an industrial process so total, it did not just build a fruit empire, it fundamentally re-engineered the planet's pantry. But this seemingly flawless system, this industrial architecture that had re-engineered the planet's pantry, was built upon a single catastrophic assumption. The entire continent-spanning machine, from the spacing of the rails in Honduras to the calibration of the ripening rooms in Omaha had been optimized with military precision for the biological characteristics of one, and only one, variety of banana. It was not a system for processing a banana, it was a system for processing the Gros Michel. Known colloquially to the trade as Big Mike, the Gros Michel was, for a time, the platonic ideal of the industrial banana. Its peel was significantly thicker and more durable than other varieties, offering a natural resistance to the bruising and handling inherent in the long journey from plantation to port. The bananas themselves grew in large, tightly packed, and uniformly shaped bunches, a geometry that allowed for maximum density in a ship's hold or a reefer car. Most critically, its biology was perfectly suited to the rigid dictates of the cold chain. It reliably entered a state of suspended animation at 57 degrees Fahrenheit without suffering chilling injury, and it responded with absolute predictable uniformity to the 1,000 parts per million ethylene shock. It was, in short, the perfect component for the factory. This absolute reliance on a single variety was not an oversight. It was the logical endpoint of the quest for industrial certainty. A system built to eliminate every variable could not tolerate the introduction of a new one. By standardizing the biological input, United Fruit had perfected its manufacturing output. The result was a staggering agricultural monoculture. From Guatemala to Panama, hundreds of thousands of acres were planted with genetically identical Gros Michel plants. This was the system's greatest strength, the source of its unprecedented consistency and market dominance. It was also a single point of failure on a planetary scale. The entire global enterprise was a pyramid balanced on its point, and that point was a single vulnerable banana. The assault began not with a corporate failure or a logistical breakdown, but with the quiet death of a single plant. On a plantation in the Bocas del Toro region of Panama, sometime around 1903, a foreman noted a single Gros Michel plant with leaves that had turned a sickly, jaundiced yellow, wilting in the oppressive midday heat. It was dismissed as a drainage issue, a localized anomaly. But a week later, an entire 10-foot radius around the initial plant showed the same symptoms. Within a month, a full acre was a graveyard of collapsing brown fronds. The diagnosis from the company's first botanists was clinical, terrifying, and absolute. They were witnessing the arrival of a new kind of enemy, one for which their industrial arsenal had no answer. The culprit was a soil-borne fungus, Fusarium oxysporum F. spicubens, soon to be known by a name that would haunt the boardrooms of United Fruit for the next half a century: Panama disease. It was not a surface blight that could be sprayed, or a pest that could be poisoned. It was a Fusarium wilt, an insidious internal saboteur. The fungus entered the banana plant through its root system and grew relentlessly up through the xylem, the vascular tissue responsible for transporting water and nutrients. Its growth created a dense, impassable blockage, effectively starving and dehydrating the plant from the inside out. Fungicides applied to the leaves were as useless as firing artillery at a submarine. The battle was already lost, deep underground. This new enemy was perfectly adapted to turn the industrial system's strengths into catastrophic vulnerabilities. The fungus could lie dormant in the soil for decades and spread with terrifying ease, in irrigation water, on the tires of a truck, on the mud caked to a worker's boots. The very interconnectedness that made the system so efficient, the shared equipment and railways that moved men and material between plantations, now became a superhighway for contagion. United Fruit's entire doctrine was based on controlling external conditions to suppress an internal biological process. But this was a biological process they had not accounted for, an enemy that attacked the very first link in the chain, the land itself. The full horrifying implications began to dawn on the company's engineers and executives with the force of a physical impact. The problem of Panama disease could not be solved by the tools that had built their empire. You could not refrigerate the soil. You could not place a quarantine around a microscopic spore carried on a river. You could not outrun an enemy that was already waiting for you in the very earth you were about to plant. The Great White Fleet and its ammonia compressors were irrelevant. The pressurized ripening room was a monument to a problem that no longer mattered. The invincible industrial machine, a system that had conquered time, distance, and biology, had finally met an adversary it could not control, intimidate, or buy. The corporate leadership of United Fruit, Men accustomed to solving their problems with overwhelming capital and brute force engineering now faced an enemy that could not be outmaneuvered by a faster ship or disciplined by a new contract. The Fusarium fungus was a biological problem, and it demanded a biological solution. The response, when it came, was a pivot as profound as the invention of the refrigerated ship itself. The war room shifted from the boardroom to the laboratory. The company, in an act of strategic desperation, launched one of the most extensive, frantic, and well-funded agricultural research projects in history. The mission was audacious in its scope. United Fruit dispatched its botanists on a multi-decade global quest, a modern-day botanical version of the search for the Northwest Passage. They were sent to the world's centers of banana diversity, the jungles of Southeast Asia, the remote islands of the Pacific, the river valleys of Africa, with a single directive: find a replacement. They became collectors, building a genetic arc of hundreds of banana cultivars, accessioning everything from tiny finger-sized novelties to bizarre red-skinned varieties, each one representing a potential lottery ticket in the race against extinction. Every accession was shipped back to the company's new research headquarters in La Lima, Honduras, to be planted in experimental plots and subjected to a battery of tests. But resistance to Panama disease was merely the first, most basic hurdle. The vast majority of candidates that proved resistant were immediately disqualified by a second, more brutal set of criteria, an unyielding list of specifications dictated not by nature, but by the machine itself. The new banana had to fit perfectly into the existing billion-dollar cold chain. Could it be held at precisely 57 degrees Fahrenheit for 7 days without suffering chilling injury? Did its peel possess the requisite thickness to resist bruising from the conveyors and packing sheds? Did the bunch grow with the exact geometry needed to maximize stowage density in a ship's hold? Would it respond with absolute uniformity to the 1,000 parts per million ethylene shock in the ripening room? This was the system's final terrible irony. For decades, United Fruit had bent technology to the will of a single banana. Now the reverse was true. The technology was a fixed, immovable constant, and biology itself had to be forced to conform to its rigid specifications. The search was no longer for a good banana, or even a tasty one. It was a search for a biological component with the exact performance characteristics of the Gros Michel. The technology now dictated the biology. The criteria were so unforgiving that for every 100 resistant varieties tested, 99 were deemed failures before a single one was ever tasted. The empire was bleeding out, and the hunt for a savior was proving to be an almost mathematical impossibility. Out of the company's sprawling genetic arc, after decades of failed experiments and disqualified candidates, a single, viable contender finally emerged. It was a cultivar from the collection of William Cavendish, the 6th Duke of Devonshire, a banana that had been cultivated in English hothouses since the 1830s. Known simply as the Cavendish, it possessed the one non-negotiable attribute that eclipsed all others. It was completely immune to the TR1 strain of Fusarium oxysporum that was annihilating the Gros Michel. Furthermore, it passed the second, equally critical test. When subjected to the rigid protocols of the cold chain, it could survive the 7-day journey at 57 degrees Fahrenheit without suffering catastrophic chilling injury. On paper, it was the genetic key, the biological savior the company had spent millions of dollars and decades of research to find. But for the executives, engineers, and agronomists of United Fruit, the Cavendish was not a cause for celebration. It was a profound, almost insulting compromise. Where the Gros Michel was robust, the Cavendish was delicate, its thin appeal making it notoriously susceptible to bruising and scarring at every stage of the logistical chain. Where the Gros Michel grew in uniform, easily packed bunches, the Cavendish stalk had a more pronounced curve, a subtle shift in geometry that complicated stowage density and handling. But the most significant flaw, the one that haunted the marketeers, was its taste. Veterans of the trade and consumers alike argued that the Cavendish was a pale imitation, a blander, less creamy, and fundamentally inferior substitute for the rich, sweet flavour of the Gros Michel that an entire generation had come to know as the definitive banana. The decision to adopt it was therefore not a strategic pivot towards a superior product. It was a choice made under duress, an act of sheer corporate survival. The relentless mathematics of Panama disease were absolute. It was only a matter of time before the Gros Michel ceased to exist as a commercially viable commodity. The choice was not between the perfect banana and a flawed one. It was between a flawed banana and no banana at all. The entire billion-dollar industrial machine, from the ships to the ripening rooms, had been built to process perfection. Now it would have to be retooled to accommodate a compromise born of desperation. The decision, born of desperation, triggered an industrial mobilization on a scale that dwarfed even the initial construction of the cold chain. This was not a simple crop rotation. It was a scorched earth retreat and reconstruction, an agricultural project of unprecedented scope and expense, executed with the urgency of a war footing. Across Central America, hundreds of thousands of acres of productive Gros Michel plantations, the very assets upon which the empire was built, had to be systematically abandoned to the fungus. New land was cleared, entire plantations were razed and replanted, stalk by genetically identical Cavendish stalk. The logistics of this switch were staggering. It demanded new handling protocols for a more delicate fruit, recalibrated packing infrastructure to accommodate a different bunch geometry, and a subtle but universal retraining of a workforce accustomed to the robust tolerances of the Gros Michel. To the global consumer, this tectonic shift was almost entirely invisible. The industrial machine, which for half a century had perfected the art of delivering consistency, now performed its ultimate act of illusion. The ships of the Great White Fleet never stopped sailing. The refrigerated rail cars never stopped rolling. The price of a pound of bananas in a Chicago grocery store barely fluctuated. An entire biological foundation was swapped out from underneath the global market, and the consumer, conditioned by decades of industrial certainty, simply adapted. The name on the bin in the produce aisle still said bananas. The fruit, though blander, was still yellow. The crisis that brought a billion-dollar industry to the brink of collapse was a footnote, a drama that unfolded and concluded entirely behind the logistical curtain. The crisis was averted. The fusarium-fueled financial apocalypse was held at bay. The cold chain empire survived. But it was an empire rebuilt on a compromise, a machine retooled to process an inferior component. The fundamental strategic error, the absolute reliance on a single, monolithic and therefore vulnerable genetic line, had not been corrected. It had merely been reset. The system was now just as rigid, just as uniform, and just as exposed as it had been before. It was a victory, but a brittle one. The war had been won, but the architecture of the next inevitable failure was already in place. A period of deceptive calm followed the Great Cavendish transition. For the next 3 decades, the global banana trade hummed with an unprecedented, almost silent efficiency. The existential trauma of the Gros Michel's extinction, the frantic, decades-long scramble against a biological clock, faded from operational memory into corporate legend. It became a sanitized, cautionary tale for new recruits, not a lesson about the fundamental danger of monoculture, but a story about the system's triumphant resilience. The company had faced an extinction-level event and won. It had executed the largest, fastest crop swap in the history of global agriculture, and the machine had not broken. This apparent victory bred a dangerous sense of invincibility. The system, having proven its ability to amputate and replace its own biological heart, now seemed more robust than ever before. The cold chain, already an engineering marvel of the early 20th century, was now perfected with the technologies of the post-war era. The analog dials and the intuition of seasoned marine engineers were augmented by digital monitoring. Satellites could track a ship's position to within a few meters, while sensors in the holds reported real-time temperature and atmospheric data, down to the 100th of a degree and the part per billion, to a central office thousands of miles away. The passive convection of the ice bunker reefer car gave way to active, thermostatically controlled units. The result was a logistical network of breathtaking perfection. It was an industrial artery, pumping billions of identical, unblemished, and now precisely calibrated Cavendish bananas to a global market that had collectively forgotten any other kind had ever existed. For the generation born after 1960, the Gros Michel was as distant and mythical as a dinosaur. There was only the Cavendish. The crisis was over. The problem was solved. The system's sense of invincibility, its belief that the fundamental problem of biology had been solved, was shattered not by a sudden catastrophic collapse, but by a series of quiet, perplexing reports that began to surface in academic journals. The story of the next extinction-level event begins in the late 1980s on a banana plantation in Taiwan. A local agronomist noted a familiar sickening symptom. A Cavendish plant, the global industry's supposedly immune savior, was showing the unmistakable yellowing leaves and sudden wilt that signaled a Fusarium infection. The observation was initially dismissed as an anomaly, a case of poor drainage perhaps, or a misidentified plant. But soon after, similar reports emerged from plantations in Malaysia. The ghost of Panama disease had reappeared, but it was haunting the wrong house. Soil samples were sent to laboratories. The initial test confirmed the industry's deepest unspoken fear. The culprit was indeed Fusarium oxysporum festans sp. cubense, the same microscopic assassin that had driven the Gros Michel to commercial extinction. But further analysis revealed a horrifying new truth. This was not the original strain, the enemy that had been so decisively defeated by the Cavendish's genetic strengths. This was a new, evolved version. Genetic sequencing demonstrated it was a different lineage, a new race. It was formally designated Tropical Race 4, or TR4, and it was flawlessly lethal to the Cavendish. The biological key that had unlocked the industry's survival had now met its own perfectly matched lock. For the big three fruit companies, Chiquita, Dole, Del Monte, the news from Asia was initially viewed not with panic, but with a detached clinical analysis. The reports were studied, the numbers were run. The affected plantations in Taiwan and Malaysia represented a vanishingly small fraction of their global supply. They were regional producers for local Asian markets, thousands of miles, and a vast ocean away from the corporate heartland of Latin America, where nearly every export banana in the world was now grown. The conclusion reached in the boardrooms of Cincinnati, Ohio and Charlotte. North Carolina was logical, comforting, and would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. TR4 was a distant regional problem. It was contained. This conclusion, born from a 20th century understanding of geography, was a catastrophic miscalculation. It failed to account for a fundamental truth of the new globalized logistics network that the banana industry itself had pioneered. In a world connected by container ships and jet aircraft, nothing is truly distant for long. The ocean was no longer a firewall, it was merely a highway. Tropical Race 4 began its slow, inexorable march across the planet. It was a patient, invisible killer, a biological saboteur perfectly adapted for the modern world. It travelled not as an airborne plague, but as a microscopic hitchhiker, a concentration of fungal spores clinging to the mud in the tread of a tourist's boot, the tyre of a shipping container chassis, or a single piece of contaminated earth-moving equipment. A single contaminated sample could carry millions of spores, each one a seed for a new outbreak. The chronological map of its spread became a series of flares in the night, each one signalling a new, irreversible breach. In the late 1990s, TR4 leaped from Southeast Asia to the Northern Territory of Australia. Then, in 2013, a far more devastating leap. It was confirmed in Mozambique, its first appearance on the African continent. A year later, it was found in Jordan, then Lebanon, Israel, and Oman. Each discovery triggered the same brutal protocol because it was the only one that existed. There was no cure, there was no chemical treatment, there was no retreat. The only response was absolute containment, the complete destruction of the infected farm, and the enforced abandonment of the land, which would remain toxic to Cavendish bananas for the next 3, 4, or even 5 decades. The enemy was advancing, and for the global industry, the map of safe harbours was shrinking with mathematical certainty. August 8, 2019, a laboratory in Bogotá, Colombia. In the sterile quiet of a government facility, a final genetic sequence confirmed what agricultural officials on the Guajira Peninsula had suspected, then dreaded for weeks. On an official report from the Colombian Agricultural Institute, or ICA, the diagnosis appeared with the force of an air raid siren: Fusarium oxysporum F. sp. cubense Tropical Race 4. The moment the entire global banana industry had prayed would never come had finally arrived. The psychological and geographic firewall that had separated the heart of the global export market from the advancing pathogen had not just been tested, it had been comprehensively breached. For 30 years, TR4 had been an external threat, a problem for producers in Taiwan, Mozambique, or Jordan, a distant line on a global map advancing with unnerving steadiness. But it was always a problem happening over there. Now, it was here. The fungus was now established in the soil of Latin America, the undisputed production engine of the world's multi-billion-dollar banana export trade. The buffer of an ocean and a continent had evaporated. The response was not agricultural, it was militaristic. Within hours of the ICA's public confirmation, Colombian President Iván Duque declared a state of national emergency. It was a mobilization on a war footing. The ICA deployed teams with the urgency of a rapid reaction force. An initial 175 hectares of farmland were not just cordoned off, they were placed under total quarantine, a biological no-man's land where no person, plant or piece of equipment was permitted to enter or exit. On dusty rural roads, biosecurity checkpoints materialized, manned by soldiers and agricultural technicians. Every vehicle, from 18-wheel container trucks to farm motorcycles, was forced to drive through shallow chemical footpaths, a desperate attempt to sterilize the contagion. This was not a containment drill. This was the opening battle of a new war, waged on the industry's home front. The 30-year Cold War, a period of nervous observation and distant skirmishes, was officially over. The enemy was no longer an abstract contaminant on another continent. It was a confirmed biological invader in the very soil from which the global supply flowed. The ghost of the Gros Michel's extinction was no longer a historical lesson. It was now an immediate and terrifying operational reality. The theoretical had become tactile. The two wars against Panama disease, separated by half a century, were campaigns fought on entirely different strategic planes. The first war, the one that drove the Gros Michel to extinction, had been a conflict of creation. It was a problem of industrial logistics, fought with the overwhelming force of capital and engineering. A strategic offensive to find a new biological component, the Cavendish, and then retool the entire global machine around its specifications. The solution was to build a new supply chain for a new banana. It was a war won with blueprints, balance sheets, and a new navy of refrigerated ships. This new war is fundamentally different. It is not a campaign of construction, but one of desperate preservation. The fight against Tropical Race 4 is a war of containment and biology, a defensive action against an invisible enemy for which there is no replacement component waiting in a laboratory. The enemy is not a flawed product, but the battlefield itself. The strategy is therefore not engineering, but biosecurity, a grueling, expensive, and ultimately fragile attempt to stop microscopic soil-borne spores from moving from one hectare to the next. It is a war of attrition. The tactics are those of a biological siege. It is a campaign waged with fences, disinfectant footbaths, color-coded tools, and constant nerve-shredding vigilance. This is a form of agricultural trench warfare, where a single misstep, a clod of contaminated mud on a worker's boot, a shared piece of equipment, a flawed irrigation channel, can breach the defenses and cede territory to the fungus, and the loss is absolute. The arithmetic of this new conflict is brutal. Losing a single meter of ground means losing it not for a season, but for 30, 40, or even 50 years, as the fungus renders the soil permanently toxic to Cavendish bananas. The perfect continent-spanning machine built to master biology had been reduced to a desperate inch-by-inch defense of its own territory. The declaration of a national emergency in Colombia revealed an uncomfortable, paradigm-shifting truth. The war against Tropical Race 4 could not be won with the same strategic doctrine that defeated the first Panama disease. The 100-year-old system of industrial logistics, the Great White Fleet, the refrigerated rail network, the pressurized ripening rooms, had been the decisive weapon in the war of creation. Now, in this new war of attrition, it was revealed to be a strategic straitjacket, a billion-dollar cage of the industry's own making. The problem was one of absolute unforgiving optimization. The entire global infrastructure had been systematically rebuilt, recalibrated and perfected over the course of 60 years for the specific biological and geometric properties of a single cultivar. The holds of the ships were engineered for the precise temperature window, between 56 and 58 degrees Fahrenheit, that the Cavendish could endure without suffering chilling injury. The automated packing sheds, the conveyors, and the stowage plans were all designed around the specific curve and weight of a Cavendish bunch. The ripening recipes, the meticulously crafted schedules of temperature, humidity, and ethylene gas were all calibrated to the unique metabolic response of the Cavendish. The system's total dedication to a single biological component was once its greatest strength. It was now its most profound liability. The system had lost all flexibility. It had become a rigid, single-purpose machine. This became horrifyingly clear as company botanists, in a frantic replay of the search that followed the Gros Michel's collapse, identified dozens of wild and cultivated banana varieties from their genetic banks that showed robust resistance to TR4. But one by one, they were disqualified, not by the disease, but by the machine. One variety might have a superior flavor but bruised if held below 60 degrees. Another was perfectly resistant but had a bunch geometry that could not fit the packing equipment. Another had an ideal shape but responded chaotically to the standardized ethylene shock, ripening unevenly. Each potential savior failed the system's brutal, inflexible test. The solution had become the problem. The very architecture that had guaranteed a century of market dominance now prevented any possibility of a simple adaptation. The fruit companies could not simply find a new banana to save their industry. They had to find a new banana that fit the old, unchangeable key. The lock, forged from $1 billion of capital and 100 years of industrial certainty, could not be replaced. The recognition that the existing industrial machine could not be changed led to a radical, counterintuitive conclusion. The banana itself had to be changed to fit the machine. This ignited a new search, an effort echoing the desperate hunt for the Gros Michel's replacement, but this time the stakes were demonstrably higher and the timeline far shorter. The hunt was on, again. But unlike the previous war, a clandestine corporate affair waged from the insulated boardrooms of United Fruit, this new campaign was decentralized and terrifyingly public. It was a global network of university genetics labs in Belgium, government agricultural agencies in Australia, and corporate R&D departments from North Carolina to the Netherlands, all locked in a race against the fungus's inexorable advance. The tools of this new war were no longer just the specimen bag and the test plot. The brute force biology of the 1940s, a process of collecting thousands of varieties and hoping one would fit, was replaced by the surgical precision of 21st century biotechnology. It was a war waged with marker-assisted selection, a technique that allowed scientists to scan a plant's DNA for resistance genes without waiting years for it to mature, collapsing a decade of evaluation into a matter of months. It was a war waged with the nascent power of gene editing, the ability not just to find a resistant banana, but to create one. The ultimate hope was to perform a kind of biological transplant on a molecular level. To take the Cavendish, the only banana the global system was built for, and surgically insert the TR4 resistance genes from a wild, inedible variety. The goal was no longer to find a key that fit the lock. It was to forge one from scratch. This new front in the war against Panama disease, however, immediately collided with an insurmountable biological wall. The problem was not methodology. It was the banana's own fundamental nature. The Cavendish, like the Gros Michel before it, is a genetic anomaly. It is effectively a sterile clone, propagated not by seeds, but by vegetative cuttings. The source of this sterility is a condition known as triploidy, where a healthy reproducing organism typically has its chromosomes arranged in neat pairs. The Cavendish has 3 mismatched sets. This genetic arrangement makes the creation of viable seeds through conventional cross-pollination a statistical impossibility, a project measured not in years, but in decades of painstaking near-zero yield effort. Breeding a new banana was not just difficult, it was functionally a genetic dead end. This reality forced researchers to abandon the established playbook of agriculture and adopt the high-precision tools of molecular biology. The focus shifted from the slow, uncertain process of crossbreeding to the surgical decisiveness of gene editing, most notably the system known as CRISPR-Cas9. The strategic doctrine was no longer about hoping for a lucky cross-pollination. It was now about performing a microscopic organ transplant. The process is one of staggering precision. Scientists first identify the specific gene responsible for TR4 resistance in a wild, inedible, and often unpalatable banana species. a genetic trait honed by millennia of coevolution with the fungus. Then, using CRISPR as a kind of molecular scalpel, they can, in theory, excise that single gene from the wild banana's DNA and surgically insert it into the Cavendish genome at a precise genetic address. The goal is not to create a new banana, but to armor the existing one, to preserve the perfect industrial component while installing a new, life-saving biological defense system. It is a race to rewrite the fruit's genetic destiny before the fungus finishes the page. The theoretical victory promised by the precise surgical power of genetic engineering appeared, for the first time, to offer a decisive end to the war. The ability to create a Cavendish banana that was identical in every way, in taste, in its response to the cold chain, in its geometry, but now armoured with a gene that made it impervious to tropical race 4, was the biological silver bullet the industry had been searching for. The perfect component could, in theory, be saved. The machine could be preserved. But this new campaign against Fusarium was not being fought on a single front. As scientists raced towards a victory in the laboratory, a second, entirely new kind of battlefield was materializing, one for which the global fruit companies had no maps, no weapons, and no strategic doctrine. For the first time in its 100-year history, the industry faced an obstacle that could not be measured in British thermal units, shipping days, or parts per million. This new enemy was consumer perception. The very tool that offered salvation, genetic modification, would brand the resulting fruit with a label freighted with decades of public skepticism and political controversy. Even if a perfect TR4-resistant, cold-chain-compatible banana was created, it would enter a global market fractured by a labyrinth of international regulations and a wall of organized opposition. The European Union's stringent precautionary principle-based approval process could take years and cost hundreds of millions of dollars, with no guarantee of success. Key grocery chains, whose brands were built on catering to a natural and non-GMO ethos, signaled they would refuse to stock such a product, regardless of the science. This revealed a final, brutal irony. The geneticist could declare a biological victory in the clean room, and the engineer could confirm the fruit met every specification of the cold chain. But their work could be rendered commercially meaningless by a single, silent decision made by a shopper with a grocery cart. The scientific solution could be rendered inert by popular opinion and politics. The ultimate arbiter of the banana's fate was no longer the CEO in the boardroom or the scientist at the microscope. The decision now rested with the consumer, standing in the produce aisle reading a label. As the race to create a genetically engineered saviour collided with the intractable realities of the global marketplace, a different, profoundly radical argument began to emerge. A small but vocal movement of agronomists and producers contended that the entire premise of the war was flawed. The fundamental enemy, they argued, was not Fusarium, but the rigid, fragile monoculture that made the fungus so catastrophically lethal. They proposed that the only long-term solution was to break from the industrial doctrine entirely. Their vision was a future of managed biodiversity, a system with dozens of commercial banana varieties, some resistant to TR4, some not, grown together in mixed fields and shipped as a heterogeneous blend. This was not a search for a new silver bullet, it was a call to abandon the need for one. The implications of this strategy were nothing short of apocalyptic for the system that had defined the banana for a century. It would shatter the very foundation of the modern trade, standardization. A container holding a mix of Cavendish, Red Dhaka, and Ladyfinger bananas would render the entire infrastructure obsolete. There could be no single, perfect holding temperature for the cold chain, no one-size-fits-all geometry for the automated packing sheds, no universal recipe for the pressurized ripening rooms. The banana would cease to be a uniform, fungible commodity. It would become more expensive, less predictable, and its appearance on a grocery shelf would no longer be a guarantee. It was a proposal to dismantle the very architecture of certainty that had built a global empire, in exchange for a messy, complicated, but ultimately more resilient chance at survival. The vision of a biodiverse banana trade, while a strategically sound response to the biological threat of Fusarium, represented a catastrophic assault on the industrial system's economic foundation. The full implications were not just a matter of changing a few procedures, they demanded the complete demolition and reimagining of the entire cold chain, a 100-year-old architecture built on the principle of absolute uniformity. The first casualty of this new doctrine would be the refrigerated ship itself. No longer could a hold be a single massive cold storage vault held at a uniform 57 degrees Fahrenheit. A mixed cargo containing a Cavendish, a red Dakar that suffers chilling injury below 60 degrees, and a ladyfinger that requires still another temperature profile would render a single-zone system functionally useless. Vessels would have to be radically re-engineered, their holds subdivided into a honeycomb of smaller individually climate-controlled cells, each with its own dedicated refrigeration, ducting, and monitoring. This complexity would slash cargo density by an estimated 30 to 40%, catastrophically increasing the capital and operational cost per stalk. This cascading fragmentation would continue from the sea to the shore. At the final stage of processing, the pressurized ripening room would cease to be a simple factory and become a complex, multivariable laboratory. The sacred 7-stage color chart, the system's universal command language, would be rendered obsolete overnight. It would be replaced by a library of dozens of different charts, one for each varietal, each detailing a unique progression from starch to sugar. The simple brute force command of 1,000 parts per million ethylene shock for 24 hours would become a complex matrix of varietal-specific recipes, demanding different gas concentrations, durations, and post-gassing temperature schedules. The elegant simplicity of ordering stage 4 would be gone, replaced by a system demanding highly skilled technicians managing a portfolio of parallel, conflicting ripening processes. The arithmetic of this new reality was brutal and inescapable. Each injection of complexity, from the decreased shipping density to the increased handling costs and the labor-intensive ripening, represented a new layer of direct expense. This cost would not be absorbed. It would be passed directly to the grocer and then to the consumer. The inevitable result would be a fundamental reversal of the banana's century-long economic miracle. The new, diverse and resilient banana would be more expensive, less predictable, and significantly more scarce. This path threatened the banana's hard-won status as the cheapest, most accessible fruit in the supermarket, the democratic staple of the modern diet. The very revolution born in the hold of Lorenzo Dow Baker's schooner would be undone. To understand the brutal arithmetic of the banana's new war, one must look past the balance sheets and the shipping manifests and zoom in on the antagonist itself. The enemy is not a market force or a logistical challenge. It is a patient, microscopic saboteur, an engine of biological destruction perfected over millennia. The story of Tropical Race 4 is a case study in horrifying efficiency, a micro-scale horror that unfolds with the inexorable logic of a chemical reaction. The war begins not in a boardroom but in a single gram of soil. The weapon is the chlamydospore, a specialized thick-walled fungal spore designed for a single purpose: survival. As a contagion spreads, the TR4 fungus seeds the soil with billions of these microscopic time bombs. They are impervious, almost indestructible, capable of lying dormant and unnoticed for 20, 30, even 50 years. They wait. They are an enemy that does not need to advance. It merely needs to be present, a patient, invisible siege line that can outlast any quarantine, any company, any man. The assault is not triggered by a command but by a presence. A young, healthy Cavendish plant, its roots extending through the soil in search of water and nutrients, begins to excrete specific phenols and other organic compounds, a normal biological process. For the dormant chlamydospore, this faint chemical signature is not food. It is a signal. It is the precise key that unlocks the spore's 50-year patience, initiating the germination process. The war does not begin with an attack, but with an awakening. The sleeper agent has received its orders. Once germinated, the fungus produces a network of fine filaments called hyphae, which actively seek out and penetrate the banana plant's root tips. The initial breach is silent and invisible. The true objective lies deeper inside, the xylem. This is the plant's vascular system, a series of continuous hollow tubes that act as its arteries, drawing water and nutrients from the soil up into the stem and leaves. Once the fungus infiltrates this network, the battle is effectively over. The TR4 mycelium begins to grow with relentless cancerous speed, proliferating through the vascular channels, forming a dense, impassable biomass. It is not just a parasite feeding on its host. It is a saboteur, systematically plugging the plant's own circulatory system from within. The result is a death from the inside out. The plant, its internal plumbing hopelessly clogged, can no longer draw water from the soil. It begins to die of thirst. The first visible symptom appears high above, in the broad green leaves. Deprived of water, they lose turgor, wilt in the heat, and begin to turn a telltale, sickly, jaundiced yellow before collapsing into a dead brown heap around the plant's base. By the time this external evidence of disease is visible, the internal war is already lost. The enemy's victory is absolute. This is the fight the global banana industry now faces, a biological siege engine against which the entire 100-year-old arsenal of logistics, refrigeration and industrial control is utterly terrifyingly useless. The 100-year-old war for the banana, as detailed in the balance sheets of American corporations and the quarantine zones of Latin America, was predicated on a stable geopolitical map. It was a conflict waged by a handful of Western companies whose logistical power radiated outwards from ports like New Orleans and corporate headquarters in Ohio, projecting control over a near-shore, dollar-denominated empire. But the arrival of Tropical Race 4 did not just fracture a biological monoculture, it shattered the old world order. The fight for the banana's future is no longer a Western story. The strategic center of gravity has shifted east. This new front is defined by the People's Republic of China. For decades, China was a secondary character in the banana's story, but by the early 21st century, it had become both a colossal consumer and a massive producer, with vast Cavendish plantations stretching across provinces like Guangxi, Yunnan, and Hainan. When TR4 began its inexorable march, it did not just threaten a distant supply chain. It landed as a direct catastrophic assault on China's domestic food production. The fungus found a landscape of dense monocultures eerily similar to those in Latin America and exacted the same brutal price. For Beijing, the devastation was not a line item on a corporate ledger. It was a matter of national food security. The result has been a strategic mobilization of resources on a scale that dwarfs the fragmented defensive efforts of the legacy fruit companies. This is not a war of containment fought with fences and boot washers. It is a concentrated, state-directed technological offensive. Prestigious government bodies like the Chinese Academy of Tropical Agricultural Sciences, working in concert with a new generation of heavily funded agricultural technology firms based in Shenzhen and Beijing, are pouring immense capital into the problem. Their mandate is not merely to find a stopgap measure, but to achieve a decisive, permanent victory. The strategic prize is not just survival, but dominance. The country that develops and patents the first commercially viable TR4-resistant banana, be it through genetic engineering or a breakthrough in conventional breeding, will hold the biological key that unlocks the entire global trade. It represents an opportunity to sever the industry's century-long dependency on Western-held patents and logistics. The implications are staggering. The solution to the banana problem may no longer come from a laboratory in North Carolina or the Netherlands, but from a research institute in Hainan, positioning a new superpower to write the next chapter of the fruit's history on its own terms. A secured compound in the Northern Territory of Australia, 6-foot-high, chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire marks the perimeter. The only entrance is a double-gated decontamination zone, where every vehicle, down to the tyres of a dirt bike, is sprayed with a potent disinfectant. The red soil itself seems to glow with a latent heat, and the air is thick, still, and oppressive. Rows of young banana plants stand in perfect, grim formation under the relentless sun. But this is not an agricultural plantation. It is a battlefield. It is a biological proving ground, a place where the theoretical victories of the laboratory are subjected to the brutal, unforgiving reality of the enemy. This is a sentinel farm, one of a handful of such facilities in Australia and the Philippines, that represent the true front line of the war against Tropical Race 4. The story of the banana's final battle is not being written solely in the sterile cleanrooms of genetic engineering labs, but here, in fields deliberately sacrificed to the fungus. These farms are a new kind of research installation, a place where the most promising banana candidates, the gene-edited Cavendish strains from labs in Belgium, the conventionally bred hybrids from corporate R&D in Central America, the output of China's state-sponsored offensive, are lined up and marched directly into enemy fire. The methodology is one of deliberate sacrifice. Plots of land, known to be heavily infested with TR4 spores, are turned into living laboratories. Here, success is not measured in yield, but in survival. A new candidate deemed resistant in vitro is propagated, shipped as a tissue culture, and planted by the hundreds in this toxic soil, placed directly alongside a row of standard, non-resistant Cavendish plants. The standard plants serve as the control group, the biological canaries in the coal mine. Their inevitable death, typically within months, confirms the relentless pressure of the TR4 in the soil. The test candidates are now in the kill zone. The work that follows is a study in grueling, painstaking observation. It is a death watch, conducted with the methodical precision of an infantry patrol. Day after day, technicians and scientists walk the rows, clipboard or tablet in hand, their eyes trained not for signs of growth but for the first, subtle signals of defeat. For each individual plant designated by a numbered tag, they record the data: a slight yellowing at the edge of a lower leaf, a loss of turgor in the tropical heat, the unmistakable droop that precedes the final catastrophic wilt. It is a slow, agonizing process where the overwhelming majority of the data collected is the documentation of failure. But in that same data, in the handful of plants that remain inexplicably green and upright while their neighbors collapse around them, lies the faint, flickering hope of a genetic key that might finally end the war. The mayor's office in Machala, Ecuador, is a simple room, cooled by a rattling air conditioner against the suffocating coastal heat. On his desk, Mateo Vargas does not study reports on crop yields or fungal biology. He studies a municipal budget spreadsheet, a grid of numbers that represents the town's lifeblood. Every few minutes, the groan of an engine a block away announces the passing of a flatbed truck, piled high with stalks of green Cavendish bananas headed for the port. To an outsider, it is the sound of commerce. To Vargas, a man whose family has lived in El Oro province for 4 generations, it is the sound of his town's heartbeat. But ever since the confirmation from Colombia, a mere 600 miles to the north, the sound carries a new dissonant undertone, the faint rhythmic ticking of a bomb. The deeper story of Tropical Race 4 is not found in the sterile quiet of a laboratory or the strategic calculus of a corporate boardroom. Its final, most devastating truth is unfolding here, in the ledgers of small-town mayors and the minds of plantation managers across the banana-producing heartland of Latin America. For nations like Ecuador, Colombia, and Costa Rica, the banana is not merely a fruit or an export commodity. It is the central pillar of the national economy, the foundational assumption upon which decades of social stability have been built. The fungus, therefore, represents not an agricultural crisis, but a slow-motion societal collapse. The numbers are staggering in their scale and brutal in their implication. Ecuador, as the world's single largest banana exporter, ships over 6.5 million tons of the fruit annually, generating more than $3 billion in revenue. This is not an abstract figure. It translates directly into the employment of over 250,000 people in a nation of 17 million, and indirectly supports the livelihoods of an estimated 2 million more. This is an entire ecosystem built on a single plant. The workers in the cardboard factories that produce the shipping boxes, the drivers who move the fruit to port, the stevedores who load the refrigerated vessels, the mechanics who service the trucks. TR4 does not just threaten a harvest, it threatens to sever the economic artery of an entire nation. For a man like Mateo Vargas, the constant what if is an exercise in terrifying practical arithmetic. If the plantations around Machala are quarantined, the paychecks stop. When the paychecks stop, the small cantinas and bodegas on the town's periphery go empty. The tax revenue that pays for the town's single ambulance, the teachers' salaries, and the diesel for the police cars vanishes. The question that keeps him awake at night is not if the fungus will arrive, but what happens to the social order the day after it does. Mass unemployment, he knows, is a vacuum. It is a formula for mass migration, for social unrest, and for the rise of illicit economies that thrive where legitimate ones have died. The war against TR4 for him is not a war for a fruit. It is a desperate defensive action to hold his own community together. The tectonic shock that registered in the mayor's office in Machala was not a localized tremor. It propagated outwards, traveling not through the soil, but along the fiber-optic cables that connect the global financial system. The news of TR4's arrival in Colombia translated the on-the-ground crisis into a new and bloodlessly precise language, the dispassionate calculus of institutional risk. While mayors worried about social collapse, analysts in offices overlooking the trading floors of Wall Street and the City of London began the cold work of quantifying the apocalypse. The first step was to give the enemy a name. In the internal reports circulated by global insurers like Lloyd's of London and reinsurance giants like Swiss Re and Munich Re, the potential extinction of the world's most popular fruit became known as a Cavendish event. This was not dramatic hyperbole. It was the formal designation of a new classifiable catastrophe, placing it alongside 100-year floods, seismic events, and political insurrections. For the first time, the complete collapse of the banana supply chain was no longer the subject of a fringe academic paper. It was now a calculable risk, a new variable to be entered into the complex algorithms that underwrite the global economy. The effect was systemic and immediate. Risk modelers, whose job is to turn fear into a number, began feeding their systems a series of horrifying new inputs: the known vectors of fusarium contagion, the 30-year dormancy period of a chlamydospore, the political instability index of Ecuador, and the total asset value of every Cavendish-producing hectare in Central and South America. The output was a series of adjustments that rippled through the financial architecture supporting the entire trade. The cost of crop insurance for a grower in Costa Rica suddenly increased by 20%. The premium for insuring a refrigerated cargo vessel sailing from Guayaquil to Port of Long Beach ticked upwards, reflecting the new non-zero chance that its entire multi-million-dollar cargo could be rendered worthless by a quarantine order upon arrival. Most critically, the invisible fungus reached into the capital markets. A multinational bank considering a $50 million loan to a company for plantation expansion now had to price in the possibility that the land, the core asset backing the loan, could become entirely unusable for half a century. Loan rates tightened, credit became more expensive. On the commodity trading desks, the futures price for bananas, once one of the most stable and predictable agricultural contracts, began to show a new and unnerving volatility. The abstract fear of a mayor in a small Ecuadorian town had been quantified, priced, and sold on the open market. A microscopic fungus, dormant in a gram of tropical soil, was now casting a long and measurable shadow over the world's financial capitals. The financial vice described in the risk models of London and New York was not an abstract threat. It was a palpable pressure felt with terrible clarity in the boardrooms of the industry's dominant powers. The big three, Chiquita Brands International, Dole Food Company, and Del Monte Foods, saw the same horrifying numbers and understood the same existential calculus. Their first highly public response was a portrait of rational unified action against a common enemy. Through industry-wide consortiums and emergency action funds, they began to pool resources on an unprecedented scale. Tens of millions of dollars were funneled into shared biosecurity protocols, funding the very disinfectant footbaths and quarantine checkpoints on the backroads of Colombia. They jointly financed public research at universities in Wageningen and Queensland, presenting a united front in the war against tropical race 4. But this public portrait of collaboration, while factually true, was a strategic necessity, a thin veil masking a far more ruthless private reality. The deeper, unstated truth was that these corporations were now locked in a state of fierce coopetition. The shared funds were a defensive measure, an exercise in collectively bailing water out of a boat they all occupied, simply to keep it from sinking. It was a strategy to prolong the status quo, to buy time. But behind the closed doors of their respective research and development centers, each company was engaged in a frantic clandestine race to build a new boat entirely, one only they would own. Each of the big three was pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into its own secret proprietary programs to find or engineer a TR4-resistant successor to the Cavendish. The prize for winning this race was not merely survival, it was absolute supremacy. The first company to patent and successfully scale a viable replacement, a Cavendish 2.0, that was immune to the fungus but still fit the unforgiving specifications of the global cold chain, would gain an almost unimaginable market advantage. That single biological patent would be the most powerful weapon in the history of the trade. The owner could demand exorbitant licensing fees from its rivals, effectively taxing every banana they sold. Or, in a more devastating strategic play, they could refuse to license it at all, starving their competitors of product and methodically driving them into bankruptcy. It would be a corporate extinction-level event, triggered not by a fungus but by a patent filing. This dual reality created a tense, high-stakes paradox. The industry's titans were simultaneously funding the shared shields that kept their collective enterprise from collapsing, while secretly forging the very swords intended to kill their partners. They were allies in a public war against biology, and clandestine enemies in a private war for market domination. They stood shoulder to shoulder against the fungus, each one working in the shadows to make the others obsolete. March 12, 2023. La Lima, Honduras. Inside a Level 3 biosafety laboratory, the only sounds are the low hum of HEPA filters and the quiet click of a keyboard. Under the unforgiving glare of fluorescent lighting, a botanist stares at a monitor displaying a magnified cross-section of plant tissue. For the last 6 months, this specimen, plantlet designation CV74B, had been the lab's most promising candidate. It was a conventionally bred hybrid, the result of a painstaking decade-long cross-pollination project, and until last week, it had remained stubbornly green and healthy in soil heavily inoculated with tropical race 4. But now the screen confirms the inevitable. The familiar strangling bloom of Fusarium mycelium is visible, a dense, cancerous mass clogging the plant's xylem. In her report, the botanist types the clinical, soul-crushing epitaph, "Candidate failed, susceptibility confirmed." It is the 94th consecutive failure. 1,800 miles to the north, at that exact moment, the kitchen of a home in suburban Columbus, Ohio, is filled with the mundane sounds of a Tuesday morning. A father, moving with the unthinking efficiency of a weekday routine, pulls a banana from a fruit bowl. It is a textbook Cavendish, a perfect stage 5 on the 7-point color chart, uniformly yellow, firm, and unblemished. With a simple paring knife, he slices it over a bowl of cereal for his 7-year-old daughter. The action is automatic, effortless, and entirely devoid of analysis. The banana, a product of a global logistical miracle, a component in a desperate biological war, and a central piece in a $1 trillion financial risk assessment, cost him 21 cents. These two simultaneous, unconnected events represent the final, terrifying paradox of the 100-year war for the banana. The absolute unthinking certainty in the Ohio kitchen is physically sustained by the near-total certainty of failure in the Honduran lab. The consumer, for whom the banana has become the most reliable and affordable fruit in human history, remains completely and blissfully oblivious to the Cavendish event. Being wargamed by insurers, the desperate race for a patented savior being run by corporations, and the slow-motion societal collapse threatening the communities that grow his daughter's breakfast. The industrial machine was built to erase the struggle from the final product, to deliver a component stripped of its precarious history. In this, it has succeeded too well. The consumer's calm is the ultimate measure of the system's success, and the most accurate indicator of its profound fragility. This profound disconnect between the absolute certainty in the Ohio kitchen and the near-total certainty of failure in the Honduran lab forces a more fundamental, almost philosophical question. After a century of industrial mastery, of capital and engineering waged against biology, is the banana itself trying to teach us a lesson? Has the entire narrative, from the holds of the Great White Fleet to the quarantine zones of Colombia, been a kind of warning? The story of the Gros Michel's fall and the Cavendish's precarious reign is not merely a corporate history of a tropical fruit. It is a parable written in the language of fungal biology and stock prices for the tremendous power and catastrophic fragility of industrial monoculture. It demonstrates, with the terrible clarity of a billion-dollar loss, the strategic bargain the modern world has made. We have traded the messy, unpredictable resilience of biodiversity for the stunning, seductive efficiency of sameness. The result was a system that could put a perfect 21-cent banana on every table on Earth, but a system so brittle it could be broken by a single, microscopic spore. This is because the crisis of the banana is not in the end unique. It is a dress rehearsal. It is a contained, slow-motion preview of a potential contagion that could strike at the very heart of the global food supply. The same industrial logic, the same drive for uniformity, predictability, and yield that created the Cavendish monoculture is the foundation upon which much of our modern food system is built. The identical strategic vulnerability, the single point of failure inherent in a narrow genetic base, underpins the global supply of other, even more critical staple crops. The Arabica coffee that fuels the world's mornings, the vast continent-spanning fields of genetically uniform soybeans, the handful of high-yield wheat varieties that account for over 20% of all calories consumed by humanity, all operate on a similar principle. They are all titans of efficiency, standing on feet of clay. The banana was simply the first test case, a canary in the global coal mine whose biology and logistical history made it the most susceptible to a systemic shock. Its crisis is a warning, an early signal flare illuminating a foundational flaw, not just in one industry, but in the very architecture of how we feed the planet. The question is not whether the mathematics of the Cavendish event apply elsewhere. The question is simply where the next one will begin. While the world's major fruit companies were engaged in a high-stakes race to develop a proprietary, patentable savior, a different kind of breakthrough was quietly emerging from a far more public-facing front. The story of what is to date the single most promising candidate in the war against tropical race 4 begins not in a corporate R&D center, but at a government-backed institution, the Taiwan Banana Research Institute. Here, after years of methodical work, a team of scientists presented a solution of breathtaking elegance and precision. They had not just found a resistant banana, they had created one, successfully taking the global standard Cavendish and armoring it. The result was a genetically modified cultivar, a Cavendish identical in almost every way, but now carrying a single powerful resistance gene, named RGA2, transplanted from a wild, inedible, but naturally immune Southeast Asian banana, Musa acuminata malacensis. The subsequent data, emerging from the brutal proving grounds of TR4-infested sentinel farms in the Philippines and Australia, was not just promising, it was statistically overwhelming. In multi-year field trials, the performance of the new line, designated GCTCV219, represented a near-total victory. In plots where the control group of standard Cavendish plants exhibited 100% infection and mortality rate within 12 months, over 95% of the GCTCV219 plants remained green, productive, and entirely asymptomatic after 3 full years of continuous exposure to the fungal pathogen. This was not mere resistance. It was functional immunity. The science revealed that the RGA2 gene acted as a kind of molecular tripwire, enabling the plant's own defense systems to detect and annihilate the fungus at the moment of initial infection, long before it could ever reach the xylem. The biological problem had, in effect, been solved. But this stunning scientific achievement, the biological key the entire industry had been desperately seeking, immediately revealed a second, perhaps more difficult front in the war. The solution came with a caveat that, in the minds of the major fruit companies, was potentially as catastrophic as the fungus itself. The new banana was a genetically modified organism. This designation transformed the problem from one of biology to one of marketing and regulatory law. For the executives at Chiquita, Dole, and Del Monte, the path from the Taiwanese lab to a North American supermarket was not a matter of agricultural scaling, but a billion-dollar minefield of public perception, political controversy, and labyrinthine legal hurdles. The European Union's novel foods regulation alone represented a potential decade-long approval process with no guarantee of success. Faced with this new reality, the gatekeepers of the global supply chain made a cold, and from their perspective, entirely rational calculation. The choice was between 2 scenarios: a guaranteed, astronomically expensive, and uncertain public battle to win consumer hearts and minds for a GMO banana, or a less certain, but far cheaper, private battle to simply contain the fungus for as long as possible. The arithmetic was brutal. The cost of funding biosecurity measures across Latin America, while immense, remained a fraction of the projected cost of launching a pro-GMO marketing and legal campaign on a global scale. Therefore, a decision was made. They would bet on containment. The most effective weapon yet devised in the war against Panama disease was left on the table, deemed too controversial to deploy. The container ship Andean Arrow cuts through the calm expanse of the Caribbean Sea, a gleaming white testament to a century of industrial perfection. Her holds are not merely cold, They are a digitally managed ecosystem, maintained by a constant stream of algorithmic adjustments at precisely 13.9 degrees Celsius. The atmosphere within is a carefully calibrated cocktail: 5% carbon dioxide, 2% oxygen, the balanced nitrogen. A gaseous straitjacket designed to suppress the metabolic rate of the 14,000 tons of Cavendish bananas locked in stasis. Real-time data streams via a dedicated Ku-band satellite linked to a control center in Charlotte, North Carolina, reporting on the health of the cargo with a granularity that the engineers of the Great White Fleet could have only imagined as science fiction. This vessel is the lineal descendant of the refrigerated steamship, the ultimate expression of the 100-year-old doctrine of industrial control. It is a masterpiece of environmental engineering, a perfect fortress designed with surgical precision to defeat the old enemies: heat, time, and the banana's own suicidal biology. The ship's systems are a flawless defense against bruising, chilling, and premature ripening. They offer no protection, however, against the enemy the bananas now represent. The threat is no longer the fruit's internal chemistry, but the microscopic saboteur dormant in the soil from which it was harvested, a threat against which the ship's climate-controlled perfection is utterly irrelevant. The Andean Arrow is a perfect weapon built for a war that's already over. It is a monument to a past victory, a mobile cathedral dedicated to solving a problem that no longer matters. It is a flawless machine built for a world that no longer exists, a world free from the threat of Tropical Race 4. As it glides towards the port of Wilmington, its algorithms performing their function with exquisite precision, it represents the entire industry's bet on containment. Distilled into a single, vulnerable hull, it is a relic of a past triumph, now sailing toward a future it was never designed to face. The two crises, separated by the deceptive calm of a half-century, represent fundamentally different kinds of war. The death of the Gros Michel was, at its core, an engineering problem. It was a linear, mechanical failure in the global assembly line. The enemy, Tropical Race 1, was a tangible threat that could be outmaneuvered with a superior application of capital and steel. The solution, while staggering in its cost and logistical complexity, was brutally straightforward. Find a new biological component that fit the existing machine. The war was won with blueprints, balance sheets, and the brute force of thermodynamics. That first victory was a demonstration of overwhelming corporate power. United Fruit met an extinction-level event and defeated it by building a bigger, better system and then performing a heart transplant on its own supply chain. The crisis, in the end, served only to consolidate the company's absolute dominance. It proved that the industrial machine was so powerful, so financially robust, that it could absorb the loss of its central component and simply retool. The lesson was one of triumphant resilience, reinforcing the doctrine that any problem could be solved by the sheer, overwhelming force of an integrated industrial system. The potential death of the Cavendish, however, represents a crisis of an entirely different order. This is not an engineering problem, it is a complex systems problem. The meticulously perfected machine is no longer the solution, it is the strategic straitjacket. The enemy is not a single fungus that can be contained or replaced, but a tangled, multi-front war with no clear military objective. The battle is waged simultaneously against the biological dead end of sterile genetics, the political fortress of international regulatory bodies, the deep-seated psychological resistance of a consumer conditioned to fear a label, and the shifting tectonic plates of global geopolitics. This is the final, terrible clarity revealed by Tropical Race 4. Where the first extinction consolidated power in a single company, the second exposes the profound, interlocking fragility of an entire globalized system. The first crisis was a brutal contest of strength, won by the side with more money and better ships. This crisis is a battle of entanglement, where every potential solution is snarled in a web of biology, public opinion, and economics. The perfect, unblinking machine built to deliver certainty has finally met a problem it cannot solve. It has met a world it can no longer control. This, then, is the state of the new war. A stalemate defined not by a failure of technology, but by its absolute triumphant success. The 100-year campaign to impose industrial certainty on an unpredictable biological process had finally cornered itself. Every potential move was a checkmate, a biological solution the genetically modified Cavendish, was rendered commercially unviable by the court of public opinion. A biodiverse solution, a return to a messy and varied supply, was rendered economically impossible by the rigid specifications of the cold chain. The only remaining option, a desperate defensive war of containment, was rendered biologically unsustainable by the patient, inexorable advance of the fungus itself. The perfect machine, designed to eliminate every variable, had finally met a variable it could not eliminate: the complex, interconnected, and uncontrollable world outside the factory walls. The story was never about a banana. It was a parable written in the language of thermodynamics and fungal biology about a single, audacious idea: that a natural object could be fundamentally re-engineered into a predictable industrial component. It was about the race to build a system so total it could conquer time, distance, seasonality, and biology itself. The refrigerated ship, the insulated rail car, the pressurized ripening room, the 7-stage color chart. These were the weapons in a war waged not against spoilage, but against chance. For a century the system won. It took a rare, perishable tropical luxury and transformed it into the most ubiquitous, affordable, and reliable fruit in human history. It delivered a miracle of consistency, a 21-cent guarantee in a paper bag. But the final lesson, written in the collapsing leaves of a Cavendish plant, is a brutal one. Nature cannot be engineered out of the equation. It adapts, it evolves, it finds the single, hairline fracture in the fortress of industrial logic and applies relentless, patient pressure. Tropical Race 4 is not an enemy in the traditional sense. It is a response. It is the inevitable countermove in a game against an opponent that does not follow human rules and does not tire. The war that began on the docks of New Orleans, in a battle against a single hydrocarbon, has come full circle. The perfect system, built to erase the scent of sweet rot that once defined the trade, now faces a rot of a different kind. A slow, systemic decay born from its own rigid perfection. The machine still runs, the ships still sail, the fruit is still delivered, but the 100-year project to defeat nature has ended. It has ended in a state of stunning, exquisite, and terrifyingly fragile suspense.